Hello, this is Randy, and welcome back to another edition of Brain Break with Randy and Keith O. I wanted to tell you several stories today. They're short, but I think they have good meaning. When I was a boy, I got drug along to funerals. I'm not always sure why I had to go, but sometimes we drove a long ways to attend these funerals. One thing I have learned to like about funerals is that you hear stories that you wouldn't hear otherwise. And I'd like to tell you some of those stories. When I was growing up, we had a house in Logan, Utah. The basement of this house was not finished. My cousin came up to see my dad. I love this cousin. He's older than me. He had returned from a mission. And while his brother was going to BYU, and they were close in age, he didn't want to wait to go to school. He came up to see if my dad could help him. My dad was at Utah State University. So my dad found out what scholarships were available and other programs. He came back and he talked to him. By the way, I never heard this story until my dad's funeral. When one of my cousins, the cousin we're talking about, actually got up and gave the life story. He shared this. Maybe he and his brother knew about it. The rest of us didn't. Anyway, my dad had gone ahead and with this cousin, they finished the basement. So he had a bathroom, a bedroom, and they got some furniture for him. And that's where he went to school when he went to Utah State. I'm not sure where he went to law school. His dad was a truck driver. He said he couldn't afford to put him through school. And there weren't scholarships back then like there are now. My dad said, yes, you can stay with us. I don't remember him doing anything but eating with us occasionally. He was just a great guy. Still love him. Always will. He went on to, while his brother was going to medical school, he went to law school. And I don't know if my dad had anything to do with that. I do know that he had a lot to do with him getting his undergraduate degree at Utah State University. He completed that degree before we moved to Tucson, and then he went to law school. But again, my brothers and sisters and I, we didn't know about this story. We learned about it at my dad's funeral. My dad died about 17 years ago. And my mother passed away when I was just 11, and we moved down when I was 8. This is a long time ago. Both cousins were just amazing. Lots of fun. We loved them. I loved all my cousins. I'm the best cousins. But anyway, I bring that up because you learn things at funerals. One of my favorite stories was I went to the funeral of a man who had been in my ward. He was a big guy. One of the reasons I loved him so much is because he made me look small. He had been a football player at Eastern Arizona and then went into the Marine Corps, where he became a helicopter mechanic, became the crew chief for Marine One. Marine One is the helicopter that the president flies around on. When the president gets on it, it's Marine One. It could be any helicopter. This brother was an amazing mechanic. He had the opportunity. When we lived in Mesa, he had worked his way up to being a vice president in charge of mechanical operations and maintenance for Delta Airlines. He basically ran their Western hub, which was in Phoenix. And once a year, he would put on a night for the young men in my ward. These were the older boys, 16 and 17-year-olds, where we would tell them to come home from school and go to sleep. And they would spend all night up at the airport. When everything was dying down, the last flights had gone out, we would go through the airport, the backside of the airport. We got to see the kitchens. We got to see how they brought food in and out. We got to see how they serviced the airplanes. And then at the very end, we were able to feed the boys. So it went from like midnight to 7 a.m. And then we'd get them to school. This is a highlight, something they really enjoyed doing. We started putting up flagpoles with the United States flag as a fundraiser. This man, who was a very brave combatant during the Korean War, he didn't want just one flag like most of us. He wanted 4. So he had one literally in each corner of his yard, in the front yard. We were happy to do that for him, and he gladly paid. He was a very generous man. But going to his funeral, they were talking about their favorite stories of this man as a father, as a husband, and as a grandfather. His granddaughter said, well, I know a story about Grandpa that none of you have told. And then she said, when we stayed with Grandpa and Grandma, what was interesting is his wife was deaf as a board. Her smeller wasn't great either, her ability to smell. And this guy, his good wife, who was, I believe, from Eastern Europe, I want to say Hungary, that may be wrong, but she put him on a diet. and he was losing weight, but he wasn't happy losing weight. So he used to get up every night. He would make himself eggs and a pork chop and hash browns, sometimes pancakes, and then he'd clean everything up and even dry it and put away the dishes. His wife would never heard it. His daughter, who was there, never smelled it either or heard it. But one night, this granddaughter got up and she said, "Grandpa, I want you to feed me too," because Grandma had put her on a diet too. And so we never knew that story until his funeral. So just so you know, if you ever have to be part of a funeral, that's the kind of story you tell. The stories that no one knows. Those are the best kind of stories. I was at a doctor's office. This man was the stake president of a good friend of ours. And that's how I got referred to him. He was a dermatologist. He and his wife, after he was released, served in the Temple presidency. One day I was there for a follow-up appointment. I was in a gown in the surgical suite. They were going to remove some things off my body. When you live in Arizona and you're exposed to the sun, you don't see a dermatologist every 5 years. You go every year. It may be just warts and stuff at first, but pretty soon they're going to start seeing precancerous spots, and they burn those off or cut them off. Sometimes they have to biopsy them. In this case, he took me back to a surgical suite because he was going to remove some things that needed to be biopsied. So I'm just in a surgical gown. And I'm back in that office waiting for him and his nurse to come back. All of a sudden, there's a knock at the door. And I said, "Come in." It was his wife. And she said, "It's okay. I'm a nurse." I knew her from seeing her in the temple when they were in the temple presidency, but that was it. But she came in and said, "Was your last name MacIf?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Did your mother live in Logan?" I said, "Yes." "Did she teach at," and she named a community outside of Logan. I said, "Yes." She started crying. I thought, well, I don't know what she did. But she said, "Your mother was an angel in my life. She was the kindest person I ever met." I said, "Tell me more." She told me that in her second grade, her mother, who was suffering something, and her dad, who was an alcoholic, she barely had enough food to eat. And my mother would come to school with clean clothes for her to wear. She would take her into the bathroom. This is before the other kids could come into the school. Take her to the bathroom, allow her to bathe herself there. It was just a spit bath, but it was better than no bath. And then take her clothes and give her the clothes that she had brought. My mother would then launder those clothes and bring them back. But my mother also provided several days' worth of clothing. She provided combs and brushes, things to put in her hair, toothbrush and toothpaste, just so that she could be like the other kids. Because the other kids for a while were telling her she smelled, her clothes were old. My mother didn't think that was very good. So she helped her. I never knew any of this. My mother had already passed. My mother passed when I was 11, and I had to be in my early 50s at this time. But she told me she wanted to thank me, make sure I knew that story about my mother. But my father had already passed on, so I couldn't share it with him. I shared it with my siblings. I think that all of the people of his generation had already passed. So I'm glad she shared it with us. Otherwise, we would not have heard that story. So these are stories that are important to share because I think it tells you a little bit about my mother. I always saw my mother as being ill. My mother ended up dying of cancer when I was 11. She was diagnosed with other problems, and they finally figured out it was cancer, but it had started in her ovaries and her uterus and then spread throughout her body. And so we actually were told to move down to Tucson because we'd been living in Logan where my mother was no longer able to teach. We moved down to Tucson because they said with the tuberculosis she had, she'd be able to breathe better. She didn't have tuberculosis. She had cancer, which had spread into her lungs. She had the last 3 years of her life were much better than they would have been if we'd stayed in Utah. We probably had another couple of years with her because of that move. We ended up loving Arizona. We missed family, but Arizona became home. It still is home. So thank you so much for allowing me to share these 3 stories. Remember, there's nothing wrong with knowing something secret, but make sure those stories get shared because they can be very faith promoting, help us want to be better. I'm grateful that this sweet lady, the stake president's wife, who had been in the temple, assistant matron, had shared that story with me, because otherwise I never would have known. I am so grateful that she took the time to make sure I knew that story. Thank you for joining me for this edition of Brain Break with Randy and Keitho. Please tell your friends and family about us, and if you can, like and subscribe, leave us a comment. You're awesome. Thank you.